Well, hello everyone. I believe you are here for the Batman After 80 Years, a retrospect panel. So then say woo! So I am joined here with Kyle Higgins and Chris Burnham.
Yay!
Of course, have done extensive work on the Batman character. So thank you guys for being here.
I'd like to point out that one of us is wearing a Batman shirt and the other is drawing Venom.
What shirt am I even wearing? Oh.
I'm sorry for the way you're sketching.
This is my brother's t-shirt. He's a rapper.
Yeah. Is it?
Yeah. That's real.
Where is he? Where in the world?
He lives in Portland or maybe Seattle. Depending on the week.
Can you guys hear us? I feel like these aren't very high.
I know.
Can you guys hear us? Yeah? No?
No?
That's talk louder.
Talk louder. Like this.
There you go.
Oh, thank you.
Sweet.
I'll do this otherwise.
Right, that might be the way to go.
And I'll point it at Chris when it says
Okay, well, I think just to start off with a question that maybe many of you want to know. How did both of you get into comics? Were you always into comics? And what was your first introduction to Batman? So it's kind of a two-part question.
For me, they were kind of one and the same in a lot of ways. There was this period in the early 90s where I discovered X-Men the animated series and the old Adam West Batman show kind of around the same time, and I was a big Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles fan. And I had friends that were really into, the Michael Keaton Batman movie had come out, but my parents said it was too dark for me to see. It's really funny now when you think about it compared to The Dark Knight or something like that. Or any of the Zack Snyder Batman stuff, which I still haven't seen. Hand to God, I've not seen it. Wow. Because I know I won't like it. And so
Why won't you like it?
I feel like it's really early in the panel for me to get into It's not my taste.
Okay.
So I just feel like it's not for me, and it's just not something that I'll probably respond to. So there are only so many hours in the day, and it's I'm not going to watch something that I have a really good probability of knowing that I won't enjoy. Yeah. And so it was really Batman the Animated Series that kind of kicked it over the top for me, because I could watch it every day. It's to this day, in my opinion, the best representation and iteration of Batman.
I agree.
In every way, shape, and form. And really, when I was doing Nightwing and any of the Bat books that I've done, I often would go back to the animated series just to see what was their distillation on a specific character. Because more often than not, I found they really kind of nail it at its core, a specific character, and then I would kind of base my take on that kind of iteration.
I know the sketching.
Yeah, I'm doing some work here. So I got into comics basically, the first stuff I ever liked in my whole life was the Battle of the Planets cartoon. That's the first thing I can ever remember liking. And then Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends and Super Friends. So I got into the characters first, and then when I realized that comics were kind of like cartoons that stood still so you could look at the drawings, I was pretty instantly hooked. So I guess my first exposure to Batman was probably him being on the Super Friends. But the first thing that I really loved was I had a Power Records, which was like an old book on tape, and it would come along with a comic, and it would super awesome voice actors and narrators, and then it goes ding when you turn the page. They are still great. If you listen to them at age 40, they're really good radio plays basically that happen to come along with Neil Adams comics. Super great, and the voice actors are so good. To this day, that's what I hear in my head.
Oh, cool.
When I imagine what Batman sounds like. The guy's kind of doing. He's kind of doing a subtle Adam West. He's just in the Adam West vein.
Right.
But yeah, I highly recommend looking for it. The music's good, all the acting's good, and there's one that's called Dark Knight of the Scarecrow or something that is straight up terrifying. It's good.
Did Adam West do some of the Batman voice on Super Friends or after Super Friends?
After Super Friends. all insulted super friends, and then it was like the new Batman Adventures. It was him and Burt Ward.
They did do it.
That's
what
for like a short period of time.
Yeah, I grew up seeing reruns of that stuff too.
Well, I know I didn't introduce myself, but I am London Jackson, and I run History of the Batman, and so I talk about all of these iterations of Batman from Adam West to the animated series, and since Chris mentioned Neil Adams, I guess I wanted to ask, do you have like comic artists that are like inspirations to you for your own work, either writers or artists that influence how you write or you draw Batman?
Who's yours?
It ended up being, my Batman is kind of a mishmash of Frank Miller, Jim Lee, and Bruce Timm, kind of with as sketched, with like a sketchy Frank Whiteley quality, if that makes any sense. I noticed as I was doing a Batman cover for a collection that hasn't been announced yet, and I was going through my old my Absolute to figure out what all the characters looked like. And I noticed that there was a big break in the way I drew Batman between Volume 1 and Volume 2, and I remembered that I came to a convention, I was signing with Grant Morrison, and there was a line from here to forever. And I was sitting there drawing like actual drawings for everyone, and Vince, the guy that works at DC and like manages this stuff, was like, hey, this is not how that works. And so I had to just do like a quick drawing, like I literally can draw Batman's head in 10 seconds now because of that experience. And so just dialing in the muscle memory of drawing Batman and Robin in like 10 seconds each, that just became like my natural go-to Batman with big giant Bruce Timm chin, with Frank Miller I hate you calling.
Yeah, actually, one of the first times you and I met was at this Drink and Draw in Chicago. And and Chris was working on a page from Batman Incorporated, Volume 2. It was in the New 52, when I launched the New 52. And I always tell the story because Grant had thought it'd be an awesome idea to set the opening of Slaughterhouse.
Yes.
And Chris was drawing the first page with some crazy curvilinear perspective stuff going on, and it was great, and I was commenting on it. And also when you see Chris do pencils, you can't make out anything. It's just a mess everywhere.
Yeah, very, very sketchy, just a smear of graphite that only I can see through.
And so I was commenting on how he can pick this stuff out and actually bring it to form in the inks. And he said that he spent a week looking up slaughterhouses for reference.
Yeah, it was a rough week, man.
And it was a line that Grant had, you were lamenting, Grant can write one sentence, and I've lost a week of my life in the worst horror film imaginable.
Yeah, and he's telling me, hey, here's a bunch of videos to look up. I can't bring myself to watch them. Oh, but make sure it's accurate.
And that was the introduction to that cow, right?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so you start off with just this horrible, fairly realistic condensation of what a slaughterhouse is over 3-4 pages, whatever it was, and then out of that horror you get this bright, shiny, ridiculous character Bathouse. So it's a pretty cool flip the switch. Man, it was seriously rough because I really was just watching video after video. How can I force a slaughterhouse is a big building, but for the purposes of the comic, I basically had to have the whole vivisection line or whatever basically happened just in one long room. So it's just figuring out where should they get hooked? Where do you where do they get their brains shot in or whatever? It was awful.
That's crap.
Anchor Batman, but you're staying.
And now, exactly.
For me, I have a lot of Batman influences for the way that I guess ultimately have approached the character, but Paul Dini is probably the biggest. And again, that spans across mediums, from the animated stuff to the animated films to his comics work. He's an incredibly underrated comics writer. He's very, very strong. So that's probably my number one. I like to play a game with artists and just with other writers where we talk about, and this is kind of what you're asking, but we'll ask each other who is your Batman? When you picture Batman or any character, if you work in comics, you tend to have specific imagery that comes to mind. And for a lot of people, it's Jose Garcia Lopez, from the 70s, right? And he did all of that specific, what is it, like the key art and stuff?
Oh, yeah, the style guide.
The style guide for DC. And so like Super Friends, everything, that's all based on Garcia Lopez's work.
And if you get those recent books for your kids of like Superhero ABC, like that's all Garcia Lopez from 40 years ago.
Yeah, still holds up.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Mine is actually, I would probably point to, on the art side, David Mazzucchelli is like probably from year one is like when I think Batman, that's what I see. That in live action, actually the Michael Keaton version. And I come from screenwriting and directing, and so that's how I tend to see things in live action first, I guess.
Well, since you were talking about David Mazzucchelli and screenwriting and making your own Batman, because when you're writing or you're illustrating the character, there's been almost 80 years worth of interpretation. So what qualities in Batman do you see that you have to implement in your particular Batman to still make it your own, but still for the audience to have it familiar that you know, oh, we're talking about Batman, we're talking about his characters, his mythology?
Well, I'll tell you, the first thing is there's an interpretation of Batman that has become more and more prominent over the years that I really don't like, and so I try to consciously avoid it, which is this, it's like the mythology of the Bat God.
Yes!
Meaning like, he has the backup plan for the backup plan for the backup plan, i.e. he can never be wrong. And it drives me crazy, and especially as a writer, like, to get a note that, and this actually never really happened when I was doing Bat books, but like from friends, like I would bounce stories off of, and we would kind of break stuff, or they'd help me break stuff. They'd be like, well, I just feel like that makes Batman look stupid. It's like, no, he can be wrong.
Exactly.
Like he's not this infallible God.
It's fine.
So I feel like that is one, like you don't want him to look stupid, obviously, but I feel like ever since, is it Tower of Babel?
When he did the contingency plans.
I feel like ever since Tower of Babel, it's gone to like the nth degree. For anyone who doesn't know, Tower of Babel is the Mark Waid story, Justice League arc, where it turns out Batman has this contingency plan for every member of the Justice League, how to take them down in a worst case scenario. And they're all very, very clever, because Mark's a really clever freaking guy. But from there, it has spawned this kind of like, and the animated series did it in later years too, where it's like, well, he just has this, you know.
Right, if he's in the thing, he can get out of it. No, I completely agree.
And the other thing is, and I guess I just tend to do this, or try to do this in all my work, is I try to subvert cliches and tropes. And so like, thankfully I don't think I ever did. I almost did it on my first big Batman story, but someone called me out on it. Starting, you'll appreciate this, starting a comic with wide shots of a city with like omniscient voiceover about the city, and then you turn the page to like a splash shot of it. Like, it's the most canned, like you think you're being profound as a writer, and it's like 101 what not to do.
I don't have anything to say. I don't know, most of the stuff that I did with Grant was so far down the rabbit hole of like what strange angles we can like take Batman from. Oh, for those of you who didn't read it, Batman Incorporated was kind of Grant's, his overall idea was that all 70 or whatever years of Batman at that point all happened to the same dude. So like even the Batman manga, like that was real. Like all the Goofy 50 stuff, like that all actually happened.
It's all one cohesive.
And so just try to figure out how to put that together and just like, Man of Bats, the Batman on an Indian reservation, that's real. How can we make that dramatic and cool? And like Batman, Batmite, that basically happened. So by the time we got around to Batman Incorporated, we were really shining lights on all sorts of different weird Batman angles. Like we never did a Two-Face or a Riddler or Joker story or anything. It was really just digging down into like the weird 70s stuff. So for me, as long as he's a guy with a cape, like it's like he's a guy with a cape who punches guys, like that's Batman.
That's Batman.
Yeah.
Oh, well, two things. In your comments, I discuss this thing called the myth of the Batman God complex.
Oh, really?
So I completely, yes.
Is that what you call it too?
Yeah, that's exactly. Oh yeah, that's exactly what I call it, and I've done videos on it and everything, because although we love this character and they love that, oh, he can do all of these things and he's human, yet they say, but he can beat Superman and he can beat all of these very powerful, beings, even though you value him being human. So it's okay for him to fail. It's okay for him to not know every single way to get out of something. And so I've done extensive discussions about that. So I completely agree with you that it's nice to have Batman kind of humanized in that way.
I tend to approach him, and maybe I wouldn't anymore, but when I was I just did 3 years writing Power Rangers.
Yes.
And I was just telling someone this the other day, as I've gotten older, I've become more comfortable with 2 things: optimism and ambiguity, as a storyteller. Mm-hmm. Not everything has to be perfectly tight and super, super neat, like clockwork. I've spent so many hours on scripts, trying to make it Christopher Nolan level, intricately plotted, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes you lose emotion doing that. You're not focusing on the right thing. But the other thing too is there is a place for hope and optimism, especially right now. I mean, the world is a pretty scary place.
Indeed.
And I think I would probably approach Batman a little bit differently now if I were doing more with him. But I do tend to err on the side of he's a bit more emotionally pulled back and reserved. Mm-hmm. And there is the Bat family, Nightwing and the different Robins, their relationship with him is strained as a result of I love my dad to death. My dad's not the most emotionally available person, Okay. And so I've always kind of tended to approach Bruce in that way. But I'd also say the majority of the Batman work I've done has not been necessarily from Bruce's perspective. It's been from Dick Grayson's perspective.
Right.
So that frames how you approach the character differently as well, Mm-hmm.
Especially since you worked on Gates of Gotham, and that was a major Dick as Batman story. So I guess just jumping into that, how did you get on that book, and what was the experience like working with Scott Snyder and the artists and kind of forming that story that explored Gotham's history and the Wayne ancestry?
I think this is a fun story. I've never told this story before, but there's a new hardcover for Gates of Gotham coming out, and that's why I feel comfortable telling you now, because I wrote it as the foreword. I had done, actually thanks to Grant's work on Batman Incorporated stuff, I had created this character called the Night Runner. He was basically the Batman of Paris before, as a part of Batman Incorporated. He was the representative over there. And he was this French Algerian from the slums of Paris, from, his mother was single, from a Muslim upbringing, and he was this really interesting character, an interesting story. And Mike Martz, the editor at the time, really responded to it and was very happy with the finished work, and Trevor McCarthy was the artist on it as well. And a few weeks later, Trevor calls me and he goes, I just got this call from Martz about doing this Batman miniseries, but I don't know. I'm like, well, that's great, man. Why do you sound he's like, I don't know what it is. It's historical, and I don't know. I'm going to do it as Batman. I was like, well, dude, if you want any help, let me know. If you need to bounce anything or have any questions, once the script comes in, let me know. So he's like, okay. And an hour later, Martz calls me, and he's like, I got a second? I was like, yeah. He goes, I wanted to see how you feel about working on a Batman miniseries writing. I was like, is this the thing you talked to Trevor about? He's like, yeah. I was like, he's really confused. He's like, well, let me tell you what we've got. He goes, we want to take some of the seeds from Grant's Return of Bruce Wayne, which spanned all these eras.
That makes much more sense. Okay, that's good to know.
We want to take seeds from Grant's Return of Bruce Wayne, and we want to basically build out this epic mystery that's so big, it spans generations, and it requires the collected talents of the Bat family coming together, including Cassandra Cain, in order to solve it. And he's like, it's going to be called Gates of Gotham. I was like, that's awesome. I was at my day job at the time. I was working as a sound editor, and I was like, so what's the mystery? And he goes, well, that's why we're calling you. And he goes, and we're soliciting it in 3 days. So this was right before the launch of the New 52. So this was a mini-series that they had wanted to do, but they only had one little window suddenly because everything was sort of being rebooted. It was still nebulous at that time. And so I go, okay. So you get off the phone with him. And he also said, he's like, you're going to write it. He's like, I want to use this as a launch point for you, both with fans, but also internally at the company. He's like, Scott is there as a safety net for you. You know, and Scott and I had become really good friends at that point. We were talking for hours every night sometimes, helping each other like break stories and stuff. And he goes, but it's your show. So we got off the phone and I just started trying to figure out how do I come into something like this and build this out. And I'm very fascinated with like the late 1800s and kind of like the building of the first skyscrapers in America and the rise of a modern city. And I thought that might be an interesting way in, was to look at the rise of an American city through arguably one of the most famous historical cities, fictional cities. And then I knew Dick was going to be Batman, and I just was fascinated by this idea of like, the families that built America, but what were the families that built Gotham? And so the Waynes, the Cobblepotts, the Elliots, the Canes, and creating a character who was an outsider who they use initially as a collaborator, but then it takes a dark turn because he's an outsider and he's not from Gotham. And I felt like paralleling that with Dick, who doesn't have roots in Gotham. For as much time as he spent there, he grew up traveling. It's not really his home. And using that story from the past as a way to reflect on his insecurity about, if I knew more about Gotham, if I was from here the way Bruce is, I'd be able to handle this, was a nice way thematically into this story, and him ultimately solving it as a way to cement not only his place in the city, but really dealing with kind of like the last remnants of like any insecurities about being Batman, right?
Right.
And so that was the way in. It just so happened it was all under the gun, and it was really my first big book at DC.
It is very good. It fits right in between, what is it, Black Mirror is Scott's first one?
So that's the other thing so Scott was doing the Black Mirror with Jock and Francesco Francavilla at the time. While I was writing this, they gave me the Nightwing relaunch for the New 52. And we realized, I brought in one of my best friends, Ryan Parrott, who writes Go-Go Power Rangers as well. Now, I brought him in to script the last 3 issues with me because I was suddenly like doing all these books and still had a day job, And Ryan and I realized as we were working on issue 5 that there was no handoff. Grant was going to do a handoff for when Bruce comes back to become Batman again and Dick steps down. And it didn't happen. He just didn't, I don't know if he didn't write it, I don't know if there was miscommunication, what happened.
We wanted to get to it eventually, and then it's just like,
So we did it in the last few pages of Gates of Gotham. And it's sort of, and then I took those threads and ran with them at Nightwing.
Yeah, it's really, it fits on your shelf right in between Black Mirror and Scott's Batman Volume 1. Like, for my money, DC really left a lot of money on the table, not just calling this Batman Volume 0, like with the New 52 thing on it. They lost you a lot of money.
It took them 7 years, but they're putting out a big oversized hardcover now. So so you should pick it up. It's out in November. It's like out like very soon. Yeah, it's beautiful. I have comps.
So Chris, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into drawing Batman and your experience with Grant Morrison? Because
this is a great story.
Yeah, so I was, so years beforehand, I had worked with Joe Casey on a book called Nixon's Pals, which is about a parole officer for supervillains, and that kind of like, leveled me up from like a C creator to a B-level creator or whatever. And then a couple of years later, I did a book with him called Officer Down, which is like a kind of RoboCop meets Toxic Avenger, but stupider sort of thing. It's awesome. It's great. and that kind of really, it was kind of a critical hit and really elevated in my profile or whatever. So I was working, at that time I was working on a book called The Amory Wars. I'm 7 issues in. And I get a call from absolutely out of nowhere from Joe Casey, who says, hey, are you free to draw Batman? it's the last issue of Grant's initial run. They're running behind on deadline. Are you free? And the answer was no, I was not free. But I was also not going to. I was not going to say no to this.
No one says no to that.
Yeah, I was like, yes, I'm free. I'll make this work. And so 5 minutes later, or whatever, I get a call from Mike Martz, who offers me this gig, and Grant and Cameron Stewart had gotten behind schedule on this was Batman and Robin 16, when Batman returns from the future at that point, past, I can't remember.
Yeah.
He comes back from his voyage through time to fight the Black Glove and Joker one last time. And so Cameron Stewart drew the first half of the issue, and then he had to go do something else. Fraser Irving comes in to draw the second half, but there was also not time for him to draw the entire second half. So I got the call to draw 7 pages in between. So Fraser did all the stuff with like Professor Pig in Gotham and all the Dolatrons or whatever, and then I did all the stuff that happened in the Batcave, which is crazy. And so just I knew script was coming, but it wasn't ready yet, so I spent the next 2 days reading the whole run, and I was just very focused on what does the Batcave look like. All my anxiety about being because I didn't know about Batman Incorporated yet. I was just I'm gonna be, this is the end of Grant's run. This is the last thing you're ever gonna see. You're gonna read 7 years of this, Grant Morrison mega epic or whatever. And I'm drawing the last 5 pages. I gotta ensure this is right. So it's just projecting all my anxiety into what does the Batcave look like. And obviously everyone draws it different. That's the whole thing with the Batcave. But I could not see my way around to that. I was just well, he draws it this way, he draws it that way. What's the right way? It's trying to figure out what's the true story of Rashomon, and it drove me crazy. So I eventually just ended up using Freddie Williams did kind of a style guide, and he rendered it in 3D. And so I just eventually settled on, okay, I'll just do that. But then in the script, Grant's the Black Glove is hiding down in the sub-secret Batcave.
Yeah.
It's on the diagram. No, it's not on the diagram. Not even a little.
So with working with Grant and even on the Batman Robin book and with David Hines, and there are different covers that you've done and interior work. There's one that it's particularly one of my favorites. It's kind of has a Parisian feel. There's the Louvre, and then there's the Magritte's inspiration, and it's based off of Earthly Delights by Ernest Bosch. It's a crazy visual story. So how do stories like that come? Because obviously that's not just a regular Batman story. That's not a regular that's of course Gotham. It's normal. How does that come? How is the communication between you drawing things like that and the writer? How does that come together, and what are the challenges in getting that?
That was a tough one. I love that cover. For years and years, that was my favorite piece of art I'd ever done. This is the cover. I can't remember honestly what issue number it is.
I think it's 26.
That feels right. So David Hines he's mostly known as a writer, but he's also a very good artist.
Really?
Yeah, he did a comic called Strange Embrace, Strange something. It's super good.
I had no idea.
Yeah, very good. And so we worked together on an issue of a comic called Days Missing a couple of years previous, which was a Roddenberry book that I think Boom put out. Yeah. And so we had a pretty good working relationship. And so he just described that cover here's the sort of thing I'm going for. And he just kind of read out this laundry list of crazy things that could happen. And it's Batman and Robin and the Night Runner in Paris, and it's getting all Salvador Dali abstract, but you've got to nail all the landmarks perfectly while crazy tripped out stuff is happening. And so it's just okay, I feel like I can smell what that looks like, but now it's just I've got to figure it out. But yeah, that was great. And there's a cool bit Robin's kind of shattered to glass, and he's looking at his own guts that have turned into gems. And there's a giant Batman head with the Eiffel Tower poking him right in the eye, which is kind of like a Chen Dalu, or however you pronounce that. It kind of nods to that. And then Night Runner is all kind of turned into spaghetti, and then half the skyline is turned on its side. It took forever.
It's so surreal.
It was one of those things where all right, now that I've got the idea and I had the thumbnail approved, now I just have to throw time at it, because I really have to nail that Eiffel Tower, which is totally obnoxious to draw the Eiffel Tower. It's just got girders all over the place, and if you don't depending on what sort of style you're working in. Some styles are more forgiving than others. If you're Bruce Timm or something, he gets a lot done with suggestion and bold shapes. but I use a dead thin line, like a ligne claire, however the French pronounce it. But so my style is basically just drawing every last element perfectly, or as perfectly as I can manage it. So it's like, here's the Eiffel Tower, draw 8,000 girders in perfect perspective. Very obnoxious.
So working on Batman Robin and then Batman Inc., you kind of talked to us about kind of how that came to be and the concept for it. One of the, I guess, most memorable issues is the one with Damian dying and that cover. So did you know that was going to happen? Like the whole Leviathan, all of that, like how were you approached with, so we're killing off Robin and you have to draw a dead Robin, so how did that? It was
so when I was working on issue 6 of the first volume, I knew that I was going to be drawing like all of the second volume, and Grant had written an outline of the second volume for like internal approval or whatever, and so I read that just to get an idea of what was going to happen, and in that outline it's like, oh my God, we're killing Damian, and I'd only drawn like an issue so far of the run, and so I'd only drawn Damian's face like one time. So like there's a page in issue 6 where Batman is walking with Dick and Damian, and he's telling him about his vision of the future, and he's like, I've seen the future, it's horrible, and not everyone makes it out alive. And Damian's got this, what do you mean, Dad, face. And so like when I drew that face, I knew that like, he's seeing his son die. So then thereafter, every time I drew him, I knew what it was headed for. So like when Alfred gives him the cat, I'm just like, oh, this is the only time he's ever going to meet this cat. So like this is the only time I'm ever going to draw him smile. Like this is the last time he's ever putting on this outfit.
I'm glad they told you because they didn't tell us.
You were surprised too?
I was writing Nightwing. I found out, I had just come out of Death of the Family. I've been up to my ears in crossovers, and then I found out I had to deal with the aftermath of Damian's death. And on top of that, hand to God, ran into Grant at a party in LA. Just randomly, there was a dude that was flying from New Zealand to do a one-man reenactment of Lord of the Rings at the House of Blues. I swear to God, the guy Thomas Toller ran legendary, put it on, and it was very strange, and it was even more strange to run into Grant.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, how's it going? And I said, I just turned in my script today for the dealing with the aftermath of Damian's death. He goes, oh yeah, that's good. Because I can't do his accent. He Dick is right there when it happens. I go, what? He said, yeah, he's there. We can't save him. He goes, I didn't tell you that. So I texted Marks from this party and I was like, is he there? He's like, I don't know, I haven't script yet. But it all worked out.
Just to talk a little bit more about your art, and I think from covers such as the one you described and your paneling, it seems that you're able to have a lot on one page and a lot of paneling, yet it's still cohesive. You can still tell everything that's going on, and it puts a lot of information like in one page. So what are kind of the challenges of that? How difficult is that to kind of put all of the characters, information, everything into one page?
Well,
and why do you panel that way?
Well, thank you. That's
it's impressive. That's why I want to know.
That's very nice to hear. That's definitely what I'm going for. So especially working with Grant, who like people's main, like the casual criticism of a Grant Morrison comic is that it doesn't make any sense, and I'm a huge fan. I'm like completely in the tank. So for me, that criticism doesn't really wash, but everyone says it, so it must be true to a certain extent. So I was determined to make sure that as crazy out there as all the ideas are, that I had to just make very sure that like the who, what, when, where was absolutely clear. So like the why and the how, like that's the confusing part. But everything else, like for my money, if you glance at a drawing for like just like showing it for a second, if you can't describe to me exactly what I showed you, then it's like instantaneously that it's like a failure. So like my goal is just like every single panel you have to be able to tell like without any words like exactly what's happening, including the emotions. So like I'm big into like cartoony emotions. So like I draw eyes a little cartoony. So if someone's mad, you got to really make them mad. If someone's crying, like you really got to make them cry. So my main focus of everything is making it as clear as possible. And then I also I took like one storyboarding class in college, so I learned about vectors, and I was just like, all right, I got to do vectors for real. So I'm always like, especially with a fight scene, like if someone's throwing a punch and a kick or whatever, I always make sure that the action is going along with the way your eyes move across the page, which makes it seem a lot faster. Like if your eyes move along with the punch. So I'm just always thinking about that, and I'm very dedicated to thumbnailing. Like I'll thumbnail a page. A thumbnail is like a very small sketch. It's not really the size of a thumbnail, but it's that big or something. So I'll thumbnail each page out multiple times, just trying to figure out how to tell it. First off, with as much clarity as possible, and then after that, it's like now that it's clear, how can I zhuzh it up or whatever to make it as dynamic as possible. Yeah, it's hard. I don't know.
No, it seems like
I'm glad we're.
But you handle it.
Well,
so.
I would say one of the things I've learned a lot from in terms of visual storytelling is I love Fist of the North Star. It's a manga anime. Huge fan of it. And when I was in college, I got like the full set in Japanese. And I can identify one character in Japanese with no. Like the Hokuto no Ken is like a little. Looks kind of like an ampersand. That's the only thing I know. That's the only word I know in Japanese. So I can't read anything. So just being able to figure out, read the story without any words, and then it's a very dynamic, action-packed comic. And just studying how Tetsuo Hara is, doing the panel-to-panel continuity. I learned way more reading it in Japanese than I would in English, because then you would get distracted by the dumb words.
So, Kyle. We discussed Gates of Gotham, but you also did a little bit on Batman Beyond.
Oh, yeah.
And
have you guys watched Batman Beyond?
Yeah.
I feel bad. I feel like we should take questions too.
Oh no, we will.
Oh, we will.
For sure. I'm going to leave a section for questions, so think about your questions while we talk. But I wanted to ask, what is it like to go from watching the TV show and then kind of put that into the comic? And then I want to talk about a particular comic.
I probably know which one.
You probably know which one, so
yeah.
That's fine.
You know what? I love that show. I loved it growing up, and I felt like when the job came up, when the opportunity was there for me to take it over and kind of relaunch it, I had felt like so much of what made the show great for me as a kid was not knowing what had happened in the missing time between Batman the Animated Series and Batman Beyond. And basically every week they would tease out something, especially in the first season, of like, they would tease out part of the mystery. Like in the pilot, Barbara, clearly there's no love lost there for Bruce.
Right.
Later in the season, I remember Terry takes a suit out of one of Bruce's closets, and he's like, the jacket fits perfectly. He's like, but who's DG? And Bruce just kind of turns away, and you're like, wow, there clearly some stuff went down, and I want these answers, even though they're really parsing it out, right? And I felt like Return of the Joker gave so many answers, and they were so incredible. Again, Paul Dini for you. But after Return of the Joker, anytime the character was used or showed up, I kind of felt like, and this goes for the comics as well, even as good as the comics were that Dustin Nguyen worked on, Derek Frichel, and Adam Beechin, there was something I felt kind of missing, just because you had gotten, a lot of that intrigue was gone. So I wanted to devise a way to bring that intrigue back, and so my run jumps forward a year and basically takes place a year after Return of the Joker, and the whole first chapter, the first issue, everything's different. Terry's in college, he and Dana broke up, and the twist at the end of the first chapter is that the voice you've heard in his cowl, and this again you can only do in comics, you couldn't do this in animation, the voice you've been hearing in his cowl, or you've been reading that's in his cowl piece, is not Bruce's, it's Dick Grayson. And Terry and Bruce have not spoken for a year. And something big happened to split them up, and you don't know what it is. And that was, once I kind of cracked that, I knew I could kind of see the shape of the whole thing. And yeah, we built it out from there. So a lot of the anxiety is early on of like, I want to do it justice, I want to, you know.
Because it's almost a build-up.
And I kind of art directed a lot of that series because that style is so ingrained in my head, especially the purple skies and different saturation levels even. And we got a different colorist after the chapter 8, and it just really started to nail more the show.
So because you wanted that build-up, and then we go into the issue where you learn about Bruce and Barbara and that situation.
Right.
And so why did you want to go in that direction? Or why did the team?
Do you guys know what we're talking about?
I don't know.
Yeah, I do.
Then, if not.
Does anyone not?
If not.
Okay. So.
I'll let you explain.
In the show, and this is going to answer. Do you know what I'm talking about?
For the most part, yeah.
In the show. And I would not have gone this way had the show not done it. Okay. So that's really the
So it was
answer.
really the show that pushed you.
The show makes it very clear that Barbara and Bruce had a relationship. And they hinted at it a number of times, and at one point Terry actually point blank asks her about it. And she's like, Dick moved to Bloodhaven and I stayed behind. And he goes, as Bruce's partner, and she doesn't say anything, and he goes, as his girlfriend? And she kind of acknowledges it, and he goes, whoa. I felt like the dynamic between Bruce, Dick, and Barbara was at its core what I was going to... It's been a few years since I've thought about this, so please forgive me.
I'm sorry for bringing up that memory then.
Well, I'm trying to remember exactly what I did, but basically that dynamic and the way it broke down was that after Dick moved to Bloodhaven, Dick and Barbara broke up, and Bruce and Barbara started their relationship, and it ended. I think after Tim Drake, after Return of the Joker, and what happened to Tim Drake, Barbara and Bruce's relationship ended, and Dick moved back to Gotham because Tim, one of his, his basically like a brother, just went through this terrible ordeal. And Barbara and Dick rekindled their relationship, and then she didn't tell him that she dated Bruce, and then it turned out that she was pregnant. And it was actually, because of the timing, it was Bruce's. And that dynamic and how it played out, and Bruce being the one to tell Dick it, rather than Barbara telling him,
right,
was just a fundamental overstep of boundaries.
It was a mess.
It was a mess. And even in the best of circumstances, any sort of situation like that in real life would fracture a relationship between people,
right,
familial or otherwise. And in the drama of comics, it went even further, and it affected Terry. And Terry was already at wit's end about some things that Bruce didn't tell him. And then to find this out cemented in Terry's mind, at that point in time, who he thought Bruce Wayne was, and he didn't want to be involved with him anymore. And so that's where it came from. The actual execution of it, in particular, with Barbara ending up losing the baby, I have some regrets about how
that happened.
The sequence played out, but the actual meat of the story was something that we had vetted, and I spent a lot of time making sure the timeline was right, and everything was on the up and up as far as Barbara and the choices that she was making, and the communication with each other, but it was the breakdown between it was really Bruce and how he handled it that really fractured things in a way that took 40 years to repair. So that's really where it comes from. And also I will say that the story where you learn all of that was framed with the Phantasm. And I wanted to bring someone back from the past. And so it's Andrea Beaumont coming in. And I don't remember what I used, what she did initially, but there's a great, one of my favorite scenes I've ever written anything between Bruce and Andrea, and they're both now in their like 80s. And she says goodbye. She says, for one last time, and calls him my love, and then it goes away in a proof of smoke. And sad.
Well, before we ask questions, since you've worked with Dick Grayson extensively, and then you worked with Nightwing, do you have a favorite Nightwing arc from your run?
Oh, from my run?
Yeah, from your run.
My run on Nightwing's really, that's tricky. It's complicated for me because especially now, years later, looking back on it, it was a series, for me it's a series of what could have been. There are issues in there I'm really, really proud of, but that time, and Chris knows too, that was a very hard, stressful time to be doing comics because DC was relaunching their entire line after 75 years, and there was just a lot of pressure all the time, and we were all trying to figure out and shape a new line, and I was also learning how to write a monthly comic. I had never done it before. And all of a sudden I'm doing it on my all-time favorite character. And so everything stings a little bit more when you may not know necessarily how to solve a problem, right? And you just feel like you're letting this character down. And your mark on this character's history and legacy is going to be smeared at best. And over time, what I started to realize was like, I mean, it sounds simple now, but the character's been around for 75 years, and he's been through a ton. I mean, the Bat characters in general, like, literally Grant and Chris's run takes him to the moon, right? Oh, maybe you didn't draw the moon thing.
I think I drew.
Grant put Batman on the moon at one point. Like, these characters can survive all sorts of different interpretations, right? And so at a certain point, I stopped thinking about it of like, what's the mark I'm going to leave on this character? Because that's very, I don't know, it's very naive and egotistical. And I started looking at it as what mark Dick Grayson was able to leave on me. And very few people are able to have that kind of relationship with their favorite character. And through better and worse, like it adds to that. Dick Grayson made me a much, much better writer. So like I would point to like my last issue on the run, which is my favorite, and then I would point to what I did last year with Trevor McCarthy. We went back and we did an Elseworld series. It was the case of Gotham team reuniting called Nightwing: The New Order. And that 6-issue series is the thing I'm most proud of, and so I'm able to like kind of go off into the night feeling fulfilled and at peace with the character. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at time, so if you have any questions, we'll take a few. I think we have enough time. So wait. Yes.
I just wanted to say not much a question, but a comment that much props and praise to the fact that it's not easy to encapsulate and to deal with one-line tropes about what you intend to do in terms of writing and different artwork. So just props and praise to what you're there to do this from.
Oh, thank you.
So this question is for the panel. What creative direction would you personally like to see for the character Batman, and why?
I don't have anything smart to say about that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I did it, so I kind of feel like I did it. And I would have an opinion if they wanted me to do something, I would have an opinion. You know what I mean? Like you develop ideas as you need them, kind of thing. And also, so much of it is when a new creator comes on to a character, it's surveying the landscape of what's going on currently and maybe what direction things have headed in, and then figuring out how to either bring things back to center or take them in a crazy direction. Like Scott coming on to do Black Mirror was the absolute perfect time for that story because it was coming on the heels of Grant's 4 or 5 years taking Batman in very, very far out places, and Scott was able to come in and tell a really grounded, gritty, Dick Grayson as Batman kind of procedural story. And the contrast between what had been going on and what Scott was doing was, it was exponential. It was magnified. And so it really is just kind of a product of the time. So I mean, Tom's doing killer stuff right now on the book, and it seems to be selling really well. So.
One more question. Back there.
First of all, amazing work. And second, what motivated you to write Batman in the first place?
I mean, the paycheck's not bad, I'm not gonna lie. Those books are in print. DC keeps their back catalog in print. No, It's my favorite. It's why I read comics. Like the Chuck Dixon, Scott McDaniel Nightwing run. Like that was my childhood. Like I love that stuff. So like I said it in jest before. Where it was like no one says no to Batman, but it's pretty true. Do you know anyone who's turned down Batman? I mean, he's the gold standard. He and the Robins and the Bat family Gotham is the gold standard. If you're gonna do work for hire, creator or big two comics, like the Bat books are the books to do. It's just, for me anyway, they're my favorite.
Okay, well, well with that, I think we are done with the panel. So I wanted to thank Kyle Higgins and Chris Burnham for talking about the creative process of
Yeah, for sure.
You got to put David Heinpohl. Very.
Yeah.
That's a deep cut.